Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Adam Institute webinar, Doing Our Duty by Hong Kong. We are hosting this webinar today in response to the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong. Shrouded in secrecy, we are nonetheless receiving tidbits as to the grave ramifications that it will have for both pro-democracy parties and ordinary Hong Kongers alike. As it's pushed through the National People's Congress in Beijing, it appears to be a done deal by June 30th. Hong Kongers are being stripped of all agency as to their own security legislation, directly contradicting the basic law. But this has not gone unnoticed. The UK has announced that it plans to open a pathway to citizenship to Hong Kongers. The US has declared that it no longer sees Hong Kong as autonomous. The Interparliamentary Alliance on China has formed, looking to fully scrutinize the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. But the deterioration of civil liberties in Hong Kong has not taken place in isolation. Growing tensions with India following the fatal border skirmish, the detentions of Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and the treatment of Uyghur Muslims point to an increasingly aggressive and expansionist China. Standing with Hong Kong in this context is not an action Beijing will take lightly. As such, we've assembled a panel from figures across the political spectrum to discuss how the UK can observe its obligations to the UK. Observe its obligations under the joint declaration to Hong Kong. It is a privilege to be joined by Joshua Wong, who I think will be joining us fairly shortly as Secretary General of Pro-Democracy Party Demosisto, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary and MP for Wigan, Tom Tugendhat, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and founding member of the China Research Group, and Ben Rogers, co-founder and chair of Hong Kong Watch. Seeing as Joshua has not joined us yet, I would like to hand over to Ben to quickly run us through the situation on the ground in Hong Kong and perhaps talk to us a bit about what the national security law means for pro-democracy advocates.
Well, thank you very much. It's a really great privilege to be with you today and to be on this very distinguished panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the other speakers. Let me just say very briefly, by way of background, that I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. So seeing this national security law being imposed on Hong Kong by the National People's Congress is really heartbreaking for me. I should also say, you will see that I have Winnie the Pooh behind me. I don't have Winnie the Pooh there just because he's a cuddly toy, but there's actually a political symbol in that, because Winnie the Pooh was banned from China by Xi Jinping, and I was also banned from Hong Kong, so we have a bit of solidarity between us. But this national security law is the culmination of several years of the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms. We've seen in previous years the disqualification of pro-democracy legislators and candidates, the arrest and imprisonment of peaceful protesters and pro-democracy activists, the disappearance of booksellers who were publishing books critical of the regime, and many other examples of the steady erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms. And as I say, I was denied entry to Hong Kong in 2017. There have been a number of other prominent foreign activists and journalists who've been denied entry, not least the Asia editor of the Financial Times and the executive director of Human Rights Watch. But this national security law takes things to a whole new level. It essentially decimates Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy. Although some of the details are still awaited and we'll have to see what the full bill says, we know that it will criminalize actions defined by the Communist Party in terms of subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign activists and foreign political groups. So, for example, this very webinar, and particularly with participation of Hong Kongers in it, could become a criminal offence next week or within the next couple of weeks. It could be illegal for Hong Kongers to talk to people like me or to Tom or Lisa. It could become impossible for people to protest peacefully, legally. And I think also press freedom, religious freedom, academic freedom will all start to be impacted as well. And let me just conclude, if I may, with two thoughts. The first is, why does this matter to us? And the second is, very briefly, what should we do about it? Why does this matter to us? Well, I think, first of all, clearly Britain has a duty, the title of this webinar, not just a moral duty, but also a specific duty under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a legal treaty lodged at the United Nations. But secondly, Hong Kong, I think, is the new front line in the fight for freedom against authoritarianism and tyranny. And because it has been until recently, one of Asia's most open, freest cities, not just an international financial center, and it matters for that reason, but also a hub for civil society, for international media, and for other forms of freedom. And the breach of the Joint Declaration and the destruction of one country, two systems essentially undermines the international rules-based order, because it is a grave violation of an international treaty. So to conclude, what can we and should we do about it? And I think there are three strands that I'd like to put on the table. The first is a diplomatic route, the second is a punitive route, and the third, but should only be a last resort, is a rescue package. Along the diplomatic route, I think Britain should be leading calls for an international contact group to coordinate a global response among like-minded countries. We should, as I know Tom has called for, along with his counterparts in Australia, Canada and New Zealand, we should be calling for a United Nations special envoy or a special rapporteur on human rights, or both. And Tom has been joined by Chris Patton, by Baroness Helena Kennedy, by the former UN special rapporteur on Myanmar, Yang Hee Lee, and others in calling for this. On punitive measures, we should be coordinating targeted sanctions, certainly Magnitsky-style sanctions, but also perhaps sanctions on key state-owned enterprises and working with allies to coordinate that. And then lastly, the rescue element. Britain has already announced some extremely welcome and I think quite historic measures to extend protection for British national overseas passport holders. There are questions and details that I think still need to be answered on that, and Hong Kong Watch has a briefing setting out some of those questions. We could come back to that in discussion. But that in itself is not enough, because there are many young activists, frontline activists, who will be in grave danger under the security law, who are not British national overseas passport holders. And so I think we need to coordinate again with allies on a sort of lifeboat rescue package, which I emphasize should be a last resort, because we don't want to be defeatist. We don't want to be saying we've lost and we'll take everybody out of Hong Kong. We want actually to put measures in place that at least have a chance of stopping this. But if at the end of the day a rescue package is needed, we should be preparing for that. So I hope those are some helpful introductory thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a couple of questions now. In terms of the way Beijing operates in pushing legislation and then withdrawing it. So I think in 2003, it was the first time that they tried to pass this kind of security law, and there was a lot of protestation, and it was withdrawn. And then we had in 2019 the controversial extradition bill. Are they pursuing a strategy of continually pushing controversial laws on Hong Kong and then withdrawing them, and then slowly grinding down the sort of the will of the Hong Kong people and hoping that they eventually acquiesce to losing their civil liberties?
Well, I think that has been the pattern over recent years. As you mentioned, the national security law was first put forward in 2003. And actually, it is important to say that the basic law in Hong Kong, Article 23, does require a security law to be introduced at some point. But I would argue, first of all, the basic law says it should be introduced by the Hong Kong legislature, not imposed by Beijing. And secondly, the basic law also has a promise of universal suffrage. And I think that it would have been much better if a security law was introduced after universal suffrage was fulfilled and fundamental rights and freedoms protected. Every country has a right to protect national security, but not in the way that the Chinese Communist Party is proposing. But yes, and then we've seen the extradition law, the national anthem law. Most of those laws, though, were introduced at Beijing's insistence, but by the Hong Kong government through the Hong Kong legislature. The thing that's different now is that they are imposing it from Beijing and therefore destroying Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy.
So I think Beijing has previously referred to the joint declaration as a historic document that sort of no longer has legal supremacy in terms of the way it regards its interactions with Hong Kong. Do you think that sort of restoring the centrality of the joint declaration is important, or should we start to prepare for a sort of post two countries, one system era, as it were, given that China seems to be pushing for that even way before 2047?
Well, I think we should still be holding to and trying to hold China to, even though they're so flagrantly violating it, the promises under the joint declaration, because the joint declaration is valid for 50 years from the handover. So at least until 2047, we have a right, not just as a member of the international community, but as a signatory to that joint declaration, to be holding China to account. And I think it would be unwise to sort of throw that away ourselves, even if China disregards it. But at the same time, we also do need to be preparing ourselves for the harsh reality that one country, two systems has been so breached, and that unless something very significant changes for the better, it is dead, and we need to find ways to respond to that, to hold China to account, and to move on that to help Hong Kongers.
Fantastic. Right, if I could pass over to Tom Tugendhat to run us through how he feels about the national security law and how we can do our duty by Hong Kong.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you, and a pleasure to be speaking alongside Benedict as well, who's done so much over recent years to speak out for human rights, not just in Hong Kong, but actually around the world as well in terms of religious freedom. This is a challenge that the UK government has not always, frankly, lived up to, but I'm very glad to say that it appears that policies are changing, and we are beginning to respect the duties that we committed ourselves to in the joint declaration, and to treat them seriously, because as Benedict correctly points out, the joint declaration imposed duties on both Britain and China. And although we have paid lip service to those duties in many ways by the 6-monthly report, we haven't always been willing to call out the violations when we have seen them. And that has been, I think, an error, because it has led some to believe that the duties no longer apply, which of course is not true. That is exactly what was agreed by President Deng and by Prime Minister Thatcher, and now it's those agreements are ongoing. What's interesting, of course, is when Deng Xiaoping agreed it, he jokingly said, if it works for 50 years, then maybe we'll renew it for another 50. That appears to be unlikely at the moment, but I do think it points to the possibility that actually, if one country, two systems is to be restored, or rather if it is to be allowed to continue, then it does certainly offer a possibility for China demonstrating, as it used to, that peaceful reunification with other provinces like Taiwan would be a possibility. Sadly, that doesn't seem to be the policy that General Secretary Xi is following at the moment. The question, of course, for the UK is, what should we do about it? Now, about a year ago, I wrote about the British national overseas status. And the reason I was interested in that is not just because I think that people should have a sort of an escape clause. It's not so much that. It's actually much more to do with the fact that I think we need to help people to find a place where they can have a conversation. And it's very hard for people to talk openly and freely if they feel threatened. And too many Hong Kongers currently are feeling threatened. And sadly, this security law has merely added to that pressure. And that's made the discussion that is so important between Hong Kongers and Beijing much harder. what Britain's place should be is in helping that dialogue and in seeking to lower that tension. And I hope that by being clear what our duties are under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, that's exactly what we will be doing. But sadly, Hong Kong is much more important than simply between Britain and China, or indeed simply for, it's more important than just for China itself and Hong Kongers. It's also important because Hong Kong has been, in many ways, the underpinning example for many areas where the international rules-based system, where international commercial law has been rolled out and has enabled commercial growth around the region. That's why I think that Hong Kong, or the failure of Hong Kong, would represent such an important failure of the international rules-based system. It's not because it's a significant element of the Chinese economy anymore. I mean, in '97, I think it was approaching about 20%. Today, it's nearer to 2 or 3% of the mainland, of the whole of the Chinese economy. But it's because it really does represent something extremely important in terms of the rollout of the rules-based system. And that's why, along with my colleagues in the committees of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, we wrote to the United Nations Secretary General asking for a special rapporteur. I hope still that countries will join us in pushing for it, because the reality is the people of Hong Kong demonstrate what an international system can achieve in their ability to build bridges and to enable success in China, as well as around the world. And if it were to be weakened, then we're undermining the security and freedoms of many other people beyond the borders of the territory itself.
Okay, so the CRG, the China Research Group, which you recently were a founding figure of, it invites comparisons to the European Research Group, which has famously advocated for a global Britain. Is it possible that we could truly recognize the goal of becoming a global Britain if we're going to have a more tense relationship with China?
Well, the name of the China Research Group is clearly echoes the European Research Group, but it's mostly a research group. So I would be careful about drawing too many parallels. The point of the organisation is to make sure British parliamentarians are aware of what is going on in Beijing, as indeed the European Research Group was initially. It ended up being something a bit different, but in its early days, it read through European documents and made sure parliamentarians were aware of them, and that's what we're looking to do, because I think, you know, it's certainly not possible to have a global Britain without a partnership with China. I think having engagement with China is an essential part of everybody's future. You can't talk about the internet or about environmentalism. You can't talk about labour standards. You can't talk about very much without having some dialogue with China. But there's no point in having a dialogue with China unless you understand what China is saying internally. And sadly, too few people speak Chinese, and even and too few are prepared to read even translations of President Xi or indeed Foreign Minister Wang's speeches. And I think what's really important for many of us is to make sure that colleagues are informed, so that events are not quite as much of a surprise as they appear to be. The truth is that much of what has been going on in China over the last 3, 4, 5 years isn't a surprise. It's been very, very long signaled. And indeed, General Secretary Xi has been talking about his brand of Leninism for a very long time. This isn't new. But it has surprised many people in the UK and around the world, because we haven't read what he's been saying. And that's a mistake that we're seeking to correct.
So in the UK, we've had controversies over Huawei's involvement in our 5G infrastructure, and we've also had a sort of a lesser known controversy over the involvement of Chinese firms at Hinkley Point as well, I think. Is it inevitable that we will have to revisit these decisions to have the Chinese firms involved in our national infrastructure? And is this something that would be opposed by the China Research Group, for example?
Well, the China Research Group doesn't take positions; it merely seeks to inform. So it would neither be supported nor opposed, because we don't seek to speak for our members. There are two different questions here. One is about critical national infrastructure, and the second is about investment. And I think the UK should be relatively geopolitically blind, if you like, to investment. I think we should be, we are an open economy, and we always have been, and this has been a huge strength. And so, except for in a few areas where there are specific threats either to market dominance or to national security, being open to investment is, I think, a position the UK will seek to maintain. But you raise questions about critical national infrastructure, and these are two different questions. So the first is the Huawei question. The Huawei question is less about the immediacy of Chinese tech threats in the UK, or indeed around the world, and much more to do with the dominance that Huawei is seeking to achieve by various different means of the global telecom network market. And the interests that all free countries have, in fact, the entire world has, in making sure there is competition, because only if you have competition do you not have single points of failure. And at the moment, the way that the market is going is leading to a single point of failure being based on Chinese tech dominance in a particular area. And I happen to think that's actually bad for China as well as the rest of the world. So I think that's where we should be looking at the Huawei question. Huawei also feeds into a concern that many of us have, that China has been clear about, which is its wish to change the internet from being a decentralized, distributed network that is effectively impossible to control into a much more controllable, centralized network that goes through certain choke points or hubs much more in a national way. And this is a plan that has been laid out, by the way, by the Chinese head of the International Telecoms Union, and indeed by other voices. In fact, it's one of the bits of information we're looking to share through the China Research Group, because of course, again, this isn't secret, or at least it hasn't been secret for a number of years, but it did come as a surprise to many people a few months ago when it was first translated into English. And so, making sure people are aware of what people are saying is an important way of avoiding surprises. So those are two different areas. Now, when you look at the nuclear power industry in the UK, there are two elements to it. The first is the investment in Hinkley Point, which is actually Chinese investment into French technology. I mean, you can be critical if you wish of the strike price of the energy or of the French technology, but it's not a question about Chinese technological investment or control. And the same is, broadly speaking, true of Sizewell. The difference comes when you get to Bradwell, which is a different reactor based on a Chinese design. And there are two reasons to object to that. The first is it is odd and expensive to decide to have two different designs of reactor in one country, because effectively you're remaking, you're re-injecting engineering risk into a product that you're trying to, or at least you should be trying to, remove engineering risk from. And the second thing you're doing is you are introducing the possibility of state control or state influence into your energy production. And that's not something that we should be supporting. And so making sure that we stay away from Chinese state control, the ability for China to control our energy markets, I think is important. And that's why we should be clear, for example, that the control boards into Hinkley should come from clean technology that Siemens has made in the past, and not by upgrading it with Chinese variants is extremely important.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I would like to hand over to Lisa now.
Lovely, thanks very much. So it looks a bit like Tom and I are sitting in the same room. I can assure you that we're not, and he looks significantly smarter than he did when I saw him first thing this morning. So well done, Tom, for putting a tie on for the occasion. I wanted to start somewhere slightly different, I suppose, and it's a reflection of the fact that I think largely there is a level of agreement on this panel, which reflects a growing cross-party consensus that the government needs to take a much more strategic approach across the board to China, not just thinking about this through the lens of growth and trade, but also thinking about this through the lens of national security and other considerations as well. So where I wanted to start is in the importance of the UK-Chinese relationship. There is a long and deep history between the Chinese people and the British people. And throughout this crisis, medical and scientific researchers from both of those countries have managed to cooperate quietly often and behind the scenes, but on that international level, even at a time when the world's great superpowers have made that cooperation very, very difficult. Our student and our cultural exchanges are incredibly important, not just to the UK as a whole, but in many parts of the country, including the part of the country I hail from, in Greater Manchester, where those student exchanges and those foreign students are incredibly important to our local economy and to society, and we felt the absence of that in recent months. And just before I came onto this seminar, I had a meeting with the Chinese ambassador at their request, but a reflection of the fact that constructive dialogue and engagement will remain incredibly important to the United Kingdom. I say that because there is no global challenge that can be solved without the involvement of the Chinese government, whether it's COVID-19, the immediate health crisis, or the reconstruction work that will happen across the world, particularly in the developing countries afterwards, climate change, or any other major challenge that Britain faces. That constructive dialogue is going to continue to be incredibly important to us. But for all of the reasons that you mentioned, John, at the start of this seminar, that relationship is also problematic, and the UK needs a far greater level of strategic independence, both at home and abroad. In the Q&A box that is rapidly filling up during this seminar, one of the questions posed is, do we need to take a softer or a harder approach to China? In many ways, the situation with the rise of China and the rise of the US has been likened to the Cold War. Actually, it's far more complicated than that. We need a constructive dialogue with both the Chinese government and the US government, regardless of who is in power, but we also need a level of independence from both. So it's not a question of softer or harder, it's just a question of having a strategy. And that strategic independence at home, I would echo what Tom said, that is badly needed, particularly in relation to key infrastructure. You're likely to see this bubble to the surface in the next few weeks, when it's likely the government will bring a telecom security bill and issues around Huawei will resurface. And it is the Labour Party's view that we need to have an alternative to a reliance not just on Chinese technology, but also on a deal with the US. We need a level of independence around that we simply don't have because we haven't invested in our homegrown industries. And I would echo what Tom said about nuclear power. I was the Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change at the time that the Hinkley Point deal, which I think was dubbed the worst deal in history, was going through the House of Commons, and raising concerns about that. The concerns about the next generation of nuclear power stations are even more acute for all the reasons Tom says. But actually at that point, what we were urging the government to do was to not just see the relationship with China through the lens of greater investment, but to have a strategy so that they could systematically assess national security implications of those decisions when those decisions were being made. And here we are all these years later, and still no real strategy at home, but as worrying, no real strategy around strategic independence abroad. To put it simply, we need to create a third pole on the landscape between the US and China so that we can speak from a position of our values, and we're free to do that without fear or favour. There was some positive noises coming out of the Foreign Office recently, exploring an Australian idea around a democratic alliance, the D10, that might pool technology in order to provide an alternative. But actually, Huawei is a very good example of what happens when the UK doesn't have that level of strategic independence and ends up squeezed between two superpowers. You see the Chinese government threatening repercussions for the UK because of the stance that we've belatedly taken around Hong Kong, while at the same time Mike Pompeo issues a statement inviting us to use US technology instead. And I think all of this is a consequence of a decade in which we haven't really had a foreign policy in Britain. Since William Hague left office, we've largely seen our relations with the rest of the world through the lens of trade and growth, and neglected those other areas, particularly democracy, human rights, the rule of law, all of which form the basis of the alliances that, in short, we're now desperately in need of. We need more friends in Britain, and we need to find them fast. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, all of these democratic countries are going to become more important to us in the future, to build what Samantha Power calls coalitions of the willing, to tackle not just issues around Hong Kong, which are incredibly pressing, and the human rights abuses and the steady erosion of the joint declaration that we're seeing there, but also to compensate for the fact that the major multilateral institutions, for various reasons, are quite simply not functioning the way that they should at the current time. And there are other issues that the world must not forget: Syria, the Yemen, and other conflict situations, as well as the very pressing need to cooperate around COVID-19. There are a number of things that I think the government could do, and to give credit to Dominic Raab, my opposite number, in relation to Hong Kong, I think the stance that he has shifted the government into in recent days, weeks, around BNO passport holders has been welcome. But in order for that to be effective, it has to be meaningful. And so far, there is very little in the way of concrete commitment about what that means, not just for those BNO passport holders, but critically for their families as well. And we've been urging the government to come forward with some detail about that. And in the end, this is not a long-term solution. As Benedict said, there are real problems for people who are not BNO passport holders in Hong Kong, to whom we also owe a moral duty. And the first principle, surely, of any sanctions against China for the actions that it's taking in Hong Kong must be not to do harm to the people of Hong Kong. And my real worry about the focus on BNO passport holders at the expense of any other measures is that that could do real lasting damage to the people of Hong Kong. So we need a better strategy with more strands to it. I think the government ought to be far tougher with British companies, particularly the British banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered, that have capitulated to Chinese pressure and are trying to take a neutral stance in an arena that frankly is not neutral. These are British companies. They should be showing the best of Britain to the world and standing up for the values that the British government has rightly reiterated in recent days. The Magnitsky sanctions, we've been pressing for that legislation to come forward. It's been 2 years now and we still haven't got that legislation on the books, but that would be a key tool in our armoury. And finally, I think this can be done. There's a level of defeatism that's crept into British politics on both left and right in recent years, particularly on the left around the EU referendum and on the right around the trade talks with the United States. But actually, we are an incredibly well-connected country with huge amounts of soft power, as well as a seat on the UN Security Council, the G7, the G20, and we shouldn't talk ourselves down in terms of the impact that we can have on the rest of the world. In recent weeks, we've seen France step up and show that level of global leadership around efforts around a global ceasefire. We've seen Australia make similar efforts around a global response to a vaccine. But Britain, there is a feeling that Britain is curiously absent from the world stage at the moment that it most matters. And that is particularly the case in relation to Hong Kong. So while I was really pleased to see Tom and his counterparts on the select committees across the world coming together to show that level of global leadership, it seems very glaringly absent from the government at the moment. And behind all of this, I think, is just a deeply confused strategy, a tension at the heart of government around how to treat China. If you listen to the Foreign Office, you'll hear a slightly harder-edged response to China in recent weeks, particularly around the issue of Hong Kong. And you may continue to see that in relation to issues around Taiwan and the Belt and Road Initiative too. But on the other hand, if you listen to the Treasury, you'll hear a very, very different approach and a very clear sign that the Chancellor sees Chinese investment, state-backed investment, as a central part of the post-COVID reconstruction for Britain when the immediate public health crisis has receded. So there is a tension there that needs to be resolved. And finally, because the bells are ringing behind me, I'll just finish by saying this. that if the UK is to have the moral standing and the influence that we should be seeking around the world in relation to Hong Kong and other issues, then we have to take a consistent approach. And that means being willing not just to call out human rights abuses where we see them in Hong Kong and in mainland China, particularly in relation to the Uyghur people, but across the board as well. So where we see abuses occurring in the United States or elsewhere, there has to be a consistent approach from this government, or we just simply will not be taken seriously as a global force.
Well, thank you very much for that, Lisa. I think we're approaching roughly the 40-minute mark. So if Tom needs to head off now, I will say thank you very much for joining us, Tom. Very insightful. Very much appreciate it. Take care. Bye. Right. Lisa, if I could ask you, you mentioned the BNO residency offer. Do you have any further insights into what you think the detail of that should be?
One of the things that we immediately asked Dominic Raab about when he made what was, I think, a welcome shift in the government's position was about the situation of families, because for that commitment to be meaningful, many of the people who hold BNO passports have since gone on to have children. So the prospect of them leaving Hong Kong to settle overseas and earn a path to citizenship is very, very limited if that is not extended as a right to families as well. The indications from the Foreign Secretary is that that is certainly something that the UK will be exploring as a priority, but potentially in conjunction with other countries as well. So trying to provide what Benedict called a lifeboat scenario, not just potentially for the BNO passport holders, but for others. But we also asked for a whole package of measures alongside that as well, because for many people, I did a round table with human rights defenders from Hong Kong just last week. And for many people, this is not, especially for the young protesters, this is not actually a sustainable solution. Many of those young protesters wouldn't be eligible for this extension of visa rights. And even if they were, many of them feel very, very strongly that this is about the future of Hong Kong. And so calling for an investigation into police brutality, and the UK taking a lead on that if the Hong Kong administration won't do so, calling for the Magnitsky sanctions, calling for more concrete measures to be taken against businesses that are listed on the London Stock Exchange but operating in Hong Kong, who are complicit in the abuse of human rights. These are all things that we think the government should do, and should do now and make a commitment around now, because this situation could still be averted, but time is running out, and so we need an urgency around this that is, with credit to a few people behind the scenes in government for trying to move this quickly. It's the urgency is lacking, and one of the reasons that I was particularly pleased that you put this event on today is because I do think we need far more urgency around this.
So we've seen Beijing sort of issue preliminary statements on these kinds of actions, and they certainly don't seem to be very willing to sort of acquiesce and back off at this early stage. We've already seen them sort of levy sanctions against Australia, for example, in calling for an international inquiry regarding its handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And we can't sort of forget the idea that China has this huge expertise in manufacturing and building things at scale. Is it possible that making these moves will make things more expensive for people who need cheap, affordable, reliable goods the most, at a time when we're just trying to reboot the economy?
Well, I think there are a sort of number of things there. The first is that during the COVID crisis, we've seen very much how a reliance on China and India in particular has complicated the situation for Britain, particularly as the issue around Hong Kong became more pressing. And, I'm grateful to the Chinese government and to the Indian government for making available to us paracetamol, personal protective equipment that we badly needed at the moment where we lacked it. But I think it has thrown up actually the problem with not having greater manufacturing capacity, not just in the UK actually, but across the world. So one of the things we've urged the Foreign Office DFID, as was or currently is until the autumn, but urged the government to think about doing is using some of that aid funding to build manufacturing capacity in many of the African countries that currently lack it, which will be an important part of the health response to COVID-19. So I think the time has come to abandon what I think has been a quite short-termist approach around Chinese investment and start to think about homegrown investment as well. And also to look elsewhere for those partnerships and alliances. So one of the reasons I think the government is making a mistake with the approach that it's taking to the Brexit negotiations. I'm somebody who has been trying to get Parliament to take seriously the need for a deal for 4 years, but I think that ongoing relationship with the European Union is going to be incredibly important to us, and the way in which those talks are being stalled in order to try to force through the US trade talks, I think is a real mistake for Britain. So I think we need a reset as a country about our trading relationships with the rest of the world, with an emphasis on homegrown industries, but also thinking much more strategically about where those primary trading relationships are going to lie.
Thank you. So as far as my understanding goes, in Dominic Raab's statement, offering the pathway to British citizenship for Hong Kong BNO passport holders, he suggested that Britain would not oppose national security legislation that passes through Hong Kong's own legislative systems. Do you think this is sort of an easy way out of making that commitment, or do you think that's a smart line to draw between putting too much risk in terms of getting too involved or not?
I may live to regret this comment, but I think that the Foreign Secretary is sincere in wanting to take a fairly tough stance to what is happening in China, and wanting to take that stance now to see if we can prevent China from following through with the pushing through the security law and taking the steps that it's taken. But I think that is not necessarily an agreed approach across government. And ironically, I think the Chinese are much better at this. So in China, they have strategic groups that are established to look at not just threats, but also challenges that are posed to the country as a whole, that are capable of looking across their economic and trading relationships, their global partnerships, their decisions about national security. And we've been calling for something similar to be established in the UK, because at the moment, I think what is happening is that there's the UK has reached out to partners like Australia and Canada in a very welcome way to try to pursue this agenda and to show China that we are opposed to the national security law. But what I think you're seeing there in the House of Commons is a watering down of the language around that, because of the tension that exists at the heart of government about how we see our relationship with China going forward, particularly with the very pressing need for investment post-COVID. So that is the tension that I think is causing havoc in government, and that needs to be resolved quite urgently. Not least because those global alliances that I talked about, that are going to become far more important to Britain over the coming years, are based on democracy, human rights and the rule of law. If we don't defend these now, we will come to regret it.
Okay, I would like to open things up a little bit and bring Benedict in, if that is okay. If we could get him unmuted, that'd be fantastic. Right, a couple of questions. So for Benedict, in terms of the pro-democracy movement within Hong Kong, does it have sort of vast majority support, or are the actions of the protesters somewhat controversial even to mainland Hong Kongers?
I think what's been really interesting and revelatory over the last year or so is that it's become clear that the movement really does have overwhelming support. And that's been clear in a number of ways. First of all, what was interesting when Carrie Lam first proposed the extradition law was that you had communities like the business sector joining forces for the first time ever, in my observation, with the pro-democracy camp, because they opposed this bill. And so you had businesses, the legal sector, other professions, and the pro-democracy movement, and ordinary people. And you saw 1 million people on the streets, and then the following weekend 2 million on the streets last summer. So that was very significant. And then what was really interesting was last November, when they had the district council elections. There was a lot of talk about the silent majority of Hong Kongers being actually pro-Beijing and anti the demonstrators. Well, the silent majority came out and spoke very loudly and very clearly for democracy. And even though there have been a small minority of protesters, and I think it's important to emphasize a small minority, who have resorted to violent actions, which I don't in any way condone. Nevertheless, despite that, people actually stood with them. I mean, not condoning their tactics, but stood with them in the movement. And so I think the message from Hong Kongers is clear. And I think one of the reasons Beijing is acting now is that they could see that in the Legislative Council elections due in September, it was very possible that a similar result to the District Council elections last November could happen, where pro-democracy parties could do extremely well, and Beijing didn't want a repeat of that.
So in terms of sorry, 1 second. In terms of the interventions made by the UK going forward, we've got a question here from Colin Blackwell of Conservatives Abroad. Last year, we submitted ideas which included easing BNO visa restrictions, including student work visa quotas for the special administrative region, and pursuing a free trade area deal with Hong Kong with mutual recognition of professional qualifications focused on ordinary Hong Kongers rather than multinationals. Do you two think that pursuing a free trade area deal with Hong Kong is still feasible, while Hong Kong holds a separate World Trade Organization seat in a way that is seen to reward Hong Kong people rather than China?
Is that who's that
Sorry,
directed to?
Either of you could answer, but both of you should chip in if possible.
I didn't quite catch all of it, John, actually.
Sorry. Apologies. I missed the question at the start there too. So it would be, last year, Conservatives Abroad submitted ideas to the government, which included easing BNO visa restrictions, increasing student work visa quotas for Hong Kong special administrative region passport holders, and pursuing a free trade area deal with Hong Kong with mutual recognition of professional qualifications focused on ordinary Hong Kongers rather than multinationals. I think he wanted to know what the panel thought of pursuing a free trade area deal with Hong Kong, and if it's still feasible while Hong Kong holds a separate WTO seat in a way that is seen to reward Hong Kong people as opposed to China.
Well, I could offer just a brief comment if...
sorry, it's quite a long-winded question, my apologies.
No problem. I think my brief comment is that, as Lisa said earlier, we must be very careful that whatever measures we do take are targeted and focused on those responsible, both in the central government in China and the Hong Kong government, for serious human rights violations and other breaches of international law, and that we don't do anything that penalizes Hong Kong itself. Having said that, I mean, the United States, of course, has now declared that one country, two systems is dead, and therefore that has implications for the special trade status that Hong Kong has with the United States. And there is a very valid argument for saying, if Hong Kong is simply, as a result of the Chinese Communist Party's actions, if Hong Kong is simply ending up as another mainland city and loses what's unique about Hong Kong, why should we treat it differently in terms of trade? So I'm not suggesting that we go down that path immediately. I think our measures should be targeted, but I think that is a question that should be on the table and should concentrate minds.
So to both of you as well, why do you think it is that Britain adopted this sort of trade-first approach through the 2010s, a sort of Cameron-Osborne consensus, when perhaps we should have been paying a bit more attention to what was happening inside China and also in terms of its aggressive foreign policy?
Well, I mean, my answer to that is fairly simple. I was elected in 2010 and watched as the sort of the approach to the rest of the world changed to become very seen through a lens of growth and trade. And it was primarily because of the global financial crash and the machinery of government being moved very much in the direction of trying to attract investment, and seeing China as a huge source of that investment. And over time that's come to become the almost sole focus of the UK in terms of how we think about our relations with the rest of the world. I mean, it's frustrating because at the same time there was work still being undertaken within the business department, within the Foreign Office, within DFID, that looked at our relationships with the rest of the world through a different lens. So the UK is a signatory to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We still have a UK National Action Plan that commits the British government and asks of British business that we present the best of British values to the world and not the worst of those values. There are a number of businesses that do take the lead on that, and over the course of the last decade, what we've seen is far less emphasis placed on that by the government, and therefore far less reward for those companies for doing so. And I think what you may see coming out of this, particularly with COVID having exacerbated a lot of the trends that we've seen and magnified a lot of those trends over recent years, you may, if we get this right, see a reset of the values on which we base that level of engagement, and a far greater level playing field then for those British businesses that are complying with the National Action Plan, are observing human rights as the Action Plan says, wherever they find themselves operating in the world. And perhaps we might also start to see a far greater emphasis on trade with other countries as well, diversifying our supply chains, and also investigating and investing much more in homegrown manufacturing and technology as well. And that, not to ever suggest that COVID-19 has been a positive, but that may be one consequence that comes out of this that will take the UK in a much more positive direction if we get that right. I say that because I really do feel that the future of this country is very much up for grabs at the moment, and the values on which we engage with the rest of the world. And it's one of the reasons that I think this debate is very welcome today. I should also say, we just had a message saying that there may be a vote in a moment. So if you see me running somewhere and disappearing very quickly, that's why.
So how ready do you think that the government is, given that the National Security Law looks to pass around June 30th? How ready do you think the UK government is to respond to that, and how do you think the Labour Party will hold them to account in terms of their promises?
Well, Benedict may be in a better position, or Tom, if he was still here, to answer the question about how ready they are. But I do think that the confusion at the heart of government is really problematic. And what we're determined to do from the Labour front bench is to make sure that this issue isn't forgotten, particularly because understandably all governments are very preoccupied by COVID-19 at the moment, but these are, human rights, the rule of law and democracy are the basis of our global alliances and therefore of our national security in the end. And so it is not in the interests of Britain to allow these things to fall off our national agenda, and we're very determined that they won't. And on that basis, I think Joshua may have just joined us, so I'm going to be quiet and let him talk.
Fantastic. Joshua, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
If you could give us a rundown of how things are going in Hong Kong for you at the moment.
Okay. So I will give a brief update for a few minutes about what's happening for Hong Kong. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's not an exaggeration to say today may be my last chance to speak in public as a free man, as a man who can speak freely without fear. When China is ramming through a draconian law, Hong Kong is now again at a crossroad. 1 year ago, it was the time when millions of Hong Kongers could still flock to street to oppose the extradition law. Land wars supporting democratic movement could still spring up across Hong Kong, and pro-democracy runner could still win a landslide victory in district council. But 1 year later, large-scale protests defying Beijing's hardline rule may no longer be an option. Dissident voices were clamped down by police brutality, with thousands of protesters arrested, many more injured or even gone missing. Worst of all, the city now faced the most devastating assault from Beijing against local and international critics. Beijing planned to pass the draconian national security law by June 13, which is before the anniversary of Hong Kong transfer of sovereignty. Under the pretext of national security, this law purports to target acts of collusion with foreign force. With the ill-defined scope of collusion, the law becomes the new weapon to punish activists and electoral candidates, and also cut off Hong Kong from the international society and their crucial support. Just like other speech crime in China, every word come from my mouth today could well become proof of crime at the Chinese courtroom in the near future. The law, the national security law, will have a cutthroat impact on the city's judicial independence. For one thing, the selection of judge. Instead of assigned judge by the judiciary, it will be the Beijing appointed city leaders who can handpick pro-Beijing judge for national security case. Besides, as Beijing claimed to have full jurisdiction over national security case, local courts are not allowed to interpret the law. They are required to consult Beijing top legislature and PCSC before issuing their ruling. The law will completely change the constitutional fabric of the territories. Even the former Chief Justice, Andrew Lee, broke silence and slammed the law as the how erosion of independence of the judiciary. Clearly, the law will deal a death blow to Hong Kong judiciary independence and the only remaining cornerstone that the world consider Hong Kong's autonomy from China. And just like China's crackdown and how on civil society of mainland China, the new law will be the threat over cities' dissidents. Journalists, activists, religious leaders, and liberal thinkers will be prime target of the law. Under China's wolf warrior diplomacy and toxic nationalism, even expats could fall victims to Beijing's whipping law, just like the two Canadians, and were just prosecuted by China in retaliation to Huawei executive arrest. Worse still, the law will punch hole in Hong Kong judiciary system, especially since Beijing has the exclusive power to extradite any suspect to the mainland courts for trial. In a country long notorious for its human rights record, NGO workers are lawyers. NGO workers and lawyers are often clamped down by Beijing in the pretext of national security, just as the civil rights lawyer and reveal his detention encounters. Prisoners are treated like pigs and extract confession through endless tortures. Once the law is passed, Beijing will impose its target tactics towards those one, including me, might be sent to black jail. And the Chinese-style secret trial and television confession will not be the things that really far away from Hong Kong anymore. And under Beijing's chilling effect, future freedom fighter will be thrown into a deadly, dangerous situation. So I would say that by installing a powerful Chinese national security agency inside the territories of Hong Kong, the law is scrapping Beijing's non-intervention promise on Hong Kong's local affairs, just like other mainland institutions stationed in Hong Kong. This new body claims itself not bound by the basic law, incomplete, and not accountable to the public. With sweeping power, the new body can supervise Hong Kong government policing, active gather intelligence, and direct interference. Even through the city's leader will set up a commission to implement the law, Beijing can appoint a special advisor from the Communist Party of China to the board to give advice and instruction, just like the CCP party secretary in Chinese company and mainland government. With Beijing power reaching every corner of the government, Hong Kong government role is extremely limited. So, beyond any doubt, China is scrapping its promise under the UN File Joint Declaration. This is an international treaty that under the Vienna Convention with legal binding power. Unlike other British former colonies, Hong Kongers were deprived our right to self-determination 36 years ago, since Hong Kong people were barred from the negotiation table between the UK government and China. And as the signatory and guarantor of the pact, the UK has legal and moral obligation, especially when China shows a complete disregard of the international law. Early this month, the UK government has announced its plan to open a pathway to citizenship for Hong Kongers. The BNO campaign provides the UK government one of the strongest leverage to exert pressure on China and to serve as a fatal lifeboat for Hong Kongers. So, last but not least, when China is waging a new Cold War on liberal democratic value, it's equally fatal and necessary for the world to step up and hold China back. At a time when China can install its own institution and exert direct rule to Hong Kong, the world should consider all necessary options to send a warning signal to Beijing, including import partial sanction, restricting export of dual-use technology and other security-sensitive items, or even ruling out Huawei from the UK 5G infrastructure, in order to prevent China from trampling on our liberal value and rule-based system. There are the necessary steps the world should consider. With the threat the bill might pass a few days later, not surprised at all, perhaps next week, Jimmy Lai, Martin Lee, and I might be sent to prison, I mean the black jail in China. To prevent this nightmare happen, now is the time for the world to stand with Hong Kong.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua. Really appreciate that. And if you hope you don't mind if I ask you a couple of questions, and Benedict, if you've got an extra sort of 10, 15 minutes or so we can extend this, if that's okay with you. Sure. So I would like to ask, what hopes do you have for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, given the scope of the national security law? How is it that we could actually sort of have building blocks for the pro-democracy movement? Could it be in the district councils, for example?
Beijing just introduced this evil bill on late May, and on early June, even Beijing and Hong Kong government banned our commemoration on the Tiananmen Square massacre. At least more than 100,000 Hong Kongers took to the street and to join the commemoration and the vigil. So I would say that now is really critical. Of course, Hong Kong people will keep our protest momentum. And if Beijing didn't cancel our upcoming election, of course, we will try our best to maximize the vote and hope to result and enhance another landslide victory again on the Legislative Council election scheduled on 6th of September. But I think the risk that we all be aware is in 2019 District Council election, only one candidate, that's me, was disqualified. But with the hardline threat from Beijing, not surprised at all, they will expand the scale of disqualification. And whether the election will be cancelled at all, that also the issue that we might need to face.
So I also wanted to get your opinion on the UK's position on offering residency, a path to citizenship, sorry, for BNO passport holders. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, has said that he is open to the national security law potentially being passed not through the National People's Congress, but through Hong Kong's own legislature. But I feel like your perspective of that would probably be that in many ways, Hong Kong's own legislative system is also compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Could you give us maybe some details on that?
According to the mini constitution of Hong Kong, it mentioned that any national security law should go through the legislation process in Hong Kong. But it doesn't mean that any Hong Kongers, including me, will agree to start any legislation process of national security bill or etc. when President Xi is tightening the freedom of Hong Kong in such sensitive and critical moment. So I would say that for the UK government, providing lifeboat to Hong Kong is an extremely good move, and we are all really impressed on it. But more important, actions speak louder than words. And how to, including other alliance from the G7 or G20 summits or from different international platforms, UK could put more warning to Beijing before 30th of June, which is really critical.
And so in the longer term as well, I mean, the joint declaration comes to an end in 2047. What are your longer term goals for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong if the UK won't be able to uphold its obligations past 2047 anyway?
We hope no matter before or after 2047, Hong Kong can still be a place with democracy, autonomy, and freedom. That's our that's our consensus in Hong Kong.
Okay, so if I could open things up to Benedict as well. What is the mood like among pro-democracy advocates within Hong Kong? Is there a sense that even meetings like this could retroactively be affected by the national security law? Is there concerns that it might be used against even members of the UK and sorry, I don't know where I'm going with that. Yes, is there the sense that the national security law could be used retroactively in terms of conversations like this? That's what I was asking.
I would defer to Joshua on that question. The only thing I would say is theoretically, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is an undertaking that they won't be used retroactively, but those undertakings are really hard to believe with a regime that has a record of breaking its promises all over the place. And then secondly, in terms of individual activists in Hong Kong, I've already had some people saying to me, you know, in messages, if I don't contact you for a while, please understand why. And sadly, I do understand why. So I'm sure there will be people like Joshua and other very brave, courageous individuals who will keep trying to use their voice, but there may be many, for very understandable reasons, who will regard it as dangerous to not just participate in a webinar like this, but even to contact someone like me on social media. But Joshua, you can speak with more authority on this.
I think now is the chilling effect that generated by Beijing, and with the definition of collusion with foreign force, which is really wide, and none of the detail is provided by the pretext of the law. Even this video conference that we public on Facebook and have the live stream can also be one of the evidence that I have the collusion with foreign force. But all we know, this conference, this video conference is just a normal meeting to express our political view. So how or why I always recognize that even country all around the world might have national security law, but the fundamental differences of the national security law of China or Hong Kong compared to others is how we could sum up the national security law of Hong Kong as kind of speech crime. And no matter you call on President Xi to step down, you call on Carrie Lam to step down, or you just criticize the government on internet, on social media, could also be arrested. And that's the threat that we face.
So I wanted to ask a quite a difficult question about the nature of protest. Obviously, protest around the issue of Black Lives Matter has really risen in importance in the US and in the UK recently. And I want to ask Joshua about how you feel about violent protests. I mean, that there has been a case in Hong Kong that there have been violent protests, and how you think that affects the movement for pro-democracy.
Political crisis must solve by political system reform, and we know in country all around the world, no matter country with free election or country just like Hong Kong, also have non-violence protester, but also some of the protester might use force. So more important is how to solve the crisis and to stop the police brutality, because de-escalate the tension is never the duty of activists, it's the duty and responsibility of the government, how to hold the police accountability. And even the clash or the tension happened, or the civil unrest in last summer. I think last November, the landslide victory of the district council election, 85% of the seat won by pro-democratic camp already imply how the silent majority stand on the side of fellow protesters.
And also in terms of how long you plan to be doing this for, I mean, you've already been heavily involved since I think about 2014.
Yeah, since when I was still in high school.
Is this something you foresee going on for the rest of your life? Is it something that you think you'll ever get any respite or rest from?
Actions speak louder than words, and since my journey of street activism from the age of 15 till now 23, I hope to commit it and let Hong Kong be the place with a brighter future. And young generation, even younger than me, including millennials and Gen X, they could be the one to determine the future instead of our future being dominated by those pro-Beijing red capital or upper class elite. So it's a difficult battle, and the number of arrested activists since last summer till now are already more than the number of prisoners in Hong Kong. 9,000 people were arrested, 1,600 people were prosecuted, more than 100 of the fellow activists were already physically locked up in prison. It's hard to predict in a city with only 7 million population. The arrested ratio is extremely high, but I think the threats can't defeat us, make us even stronger determination. So supporting Hong Kong is not about the matter of left or right, it's the matter of right or wrong. So we will continue, hope to connect and interact with world leaders and politicians around the world, and also seek for more collaboration and interaction to stand with Hong Kong. And apart from anti-Beijing crackdown, I think the street activism and the youth activism in Hong Kong could also have more collaboration and interaction with movement around the world, no matter Black Lives Matter or others, and let people to know that how we as human rights defenders also share all the universal values that all we cherish.
Well, on that note, I would like to say thank you so much to our 2 panelists. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us, and Benedict, to you as well. And, thank you so much, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.